Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrew Littell, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome to Google Simon Winchester. Mr. Winchester, welcome to Google.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I'd like to start out today by asking you about your latest book, The Men Who United the States. What drove you to write about this particular aspect of American history?
Well, I'd become a citizen on Independence Day, thank you very much indeed, in 2011. And because of that, and it is a very emotional thing to be inducted into this great amalgam of people. And I was very proud and happy because I'd been fascinated with America ever since I hitchhiked around it in 1962 when I was 17. And so once become a citizen, I thought I would love to have a bash at writing a book, but I didn't really know how to. I mean, it's an enormous subject. I mean, and it's also a subject which has been written about by thousands of people, academics and explorers and journalists. And so it was a question of trying to write it in a way that was fresh and different, but nonetheless told a story that I thought was compelling. And I came up with a variety of ideas, none of which initially piqued my interest, or more importantly, my editor's interest. But the fourth one, and it wasn't three as a charm, it was four as a charm in this case, I was just ruminating one day on the name of the country, the United States of America, and looking specifically at this adjective, united, and how did that happen to come about? Not merely come about, but to remain a coherent aspect of this country for most of its existence, with obviously the single exception of the 1860s and the terrible events of the Civil War. Because it occurred to me that of the other great entities on the world surface, Canada, let's say, Russia, Europe, none of them had seriously achieved total and lasting unity. I mean, dear old Canada, we love it, but the fact of the matter is that there is this great francophone bloc in the middle, Quebec, which is forever threatening, sometimes loudly, sometimes less so, to split the country into three. Soviet Union, we've seen what's happened in the aftermath of the breakup of the Soviet Union, dozens of little states, often hostile to one another. And Europe, where I'm from, I mean, despite the best efforts of idealist politicians since the 1950s, we can't really rightly say that it's achieved total unity. I mean, if you try and, well, I mean, at a serious level, here's England. We don't use the euro. We're at the moment thinking about splitting apart from Scotland. There's it's coming up for discussion in 18 months or so. Within Europe itself, I mean, Switzerland's not a part of the European Union. If you try and plug your electric razor in Stockholm, you'll need a different plug from the one you use in Madrid. And everyone's speaking in different languages, and there is no common language in Europe. And yet America, which is this great mongrel amalgam of peoples of every imaginable ethnic background and religious affiliation and political viewpoint, does manage to hang together. And I thought, let's ruminate on this word, united. And then it was a question of how to structure a book. And that was in a way the more difficult thing. But we can talk about that as we move along, I dare say.
Well, it's, the thing that immediately, even before I picked up the book and was just looking at the title, I was really captivated by this idea of regionalism as a part of being united. And so looking at the wide variety of regions that are represented within this United States. And I think it's a very delicate balance between allowing differences and regional characteristics to flourish, but also being part of a greater.
Well, it is. I mean, the variation that you speak of, I've become somewhat involved in a project related to that as well, which is for the last 50 years in Madison, Wisconsin, they've been preparing a dictionary, which they've at last finished, but you probably know about DARE, the Dictionary of American Regional English, which, it's a very long story, but basically when it was initiated in the 1960s by people that believed there was huge variation within this country linguistically and dialectically, let's record it before it all evanesces. And America, everyone speaks exactly the same, which hasn't happened, of course. And they sent these people to the furthest reaches of this country in what were called word wagons. And they went down to little villages in Louisiana or up in Alaska or up in Maine and found the oldest person that had lived there for decades and asked them. They had a huge 350-page questionnaire. I mean, it must have been a daunting prospect to see these two young students turn up on your doorstep and ask you the same questions every time. You know, what do you call the insect that bites you on the neck in the summertime? What do you call the strip of grass between the front of your house and the curb? And they built up from this immense dictionary. It's 6 volumes. It was just finished last year, which displays majestically the variation that you talk about. So when we drive down the interstate and we're just confronted by Walgreens and McDonald's and everything looks the same, once you get off the interstates, it really isn't. And what you say is so true, that out of this astonishing variety which still exists, nonetheless, connective tissue which makes everyone able to say, I am an American, which allows me to say that nowadays, of course, is something that I wanted to write about.
Yeah, yeah. It's well. Let's talk about the structure a little bit, because I think your, I mean, this could, you know, when you talk about the men who united the states, it could very easily be a list of men in alphabetical order, with very long entries for some and shorter entries for another. But that wouldn't make very good reading. And so the device or the technique, I think, that you've stumbled upon is really interesting. And if you could talk a little bit more about.
Yes, I mean, you're absolutely right. I've always maintained that in writing non-fiction, there are 3 crucial elements. There's the idea, which is king. Good writing helps, but it's not, in my view, the second most important thing. I think the second most important thing is the structure of the book. You can write lyrically about a wonderful idea, but if the structure's off, the reader will be turned away. So I had to come up. You're absolutely right. I was preparing a list of the people, and it has to be said at the outset that most of them were men who actually created the physical links that bind this country together. And looking at this list, which was 100 and 120 odd people, many of them well known, but most of them very little known, how to organize it. Yes, of course, it could have been in alphabetical order. That would have been just like looking through an encyclopedia, really dull. It could have been in chronological order, which does have a sort of narrative logic to it, but their achievements and their interests were all over the map. And so the reader would be, you know, reading of a 19th century person involved in, you know, electricity, and then another one involved in canal making, and would find the same thing in the 20th century. So that would be very, very confusing. And so one day I was writing to a friend of mine in China, and I had lived in China for a long while, and he was reminding me about Eastern philosophies, essentially all those east of India, where I'd also lived for a while, having at the base of many of their philosophical beliefs 4 or 5 classical elements, and particularly in China. And these elements sort of underpin everything, and the interaction between these elements, and they're wood, earth, water, fire, and metal. And it suddenly seemed to me, looking at these 5 categories and looking at this list of 120 names, that you could actually, and quite logically and quite reasonably, shoehorn these names into these categories, and it would all sort of work. So all the early explorers, because they were essentially hacking their way through forests, they were in birch bark and wooden canoes, they were building palisades of wood to protect themselves, they were burning log fires to keep away the wolves and so forth. You could say early American explorers could be put under a rubric of wood. And similarly, once the country as the extent had been defined by these early explorers, of whom, of course, Lewis and Clark were the most famous, then it would be the early geologists and surveyors who were trying to work out what America was made of. Well, that's all to do with Earth, because the geologists are, you know, rock hounds hitting things with hammers and examining them through magnifying glass. So Earth seemed to cover those people and those achievements. And then water, the third of these elements. Well, the early explorers, the early settlers would, if not exploring it, venturing into the country, they would do so in the rivers, the Rappahannock and the James and the Susquehanna and the Potomac and the Hudson. And that when they got to about 50 or 60 miles upstream, they suddenly found that they couldn't go any further because there was a line of waterfalls, because that's where the Appalachians became the coastal plain. And so they settled there initially in settlements that would eventually evolve into places like Richmond and Fredericksburg and Washington, D.C. and Albany. And then they would begin trading with people perhaps upstream of them, and they would, to get round the rapids, they would build very primitive canals. And once they learned how to do that, then they would build canals elsewhere in the country, and famous ones like the Manchester Canal, which effectively gave birth to Boston as a major mercantile center, and the Erie Canal, the most famous of all, which essentially made New York a mercantile center. So that all worked under the rubric of water. And then fire, well, it seemed to me that it was all very well to travel behind a horse on a canal, but that's not very rapidly crossing the country. In America in the 1850s and 1860s, it was picking up speed. Speed was a necessary part of commerce and moving people hither and yon. And this had coincided with James Watt's invention of the steam engine. And so suddenly fire-based machinery was brought into play to drive initially railway trains, and then early motor cars, and then other forms of fire were used to power the internal combustion engine. And so we get roads and we get highways, and then we get aeroplanes. So that all worked under the rubric of fire. And then the fifth and final of these Chinese classical elements was metal. And that seemed to me was the metal of the telegraph wire, and the metal of electricity distribution, and then of the telephone, and then radio, and then television, and then what we're doing today, all the internet and everything that Google stands for. So it did seem that these five categories not only worked, but also were themselves in chronological order, because wood comes before earth, comes before water. And so.
Yeah, it's nice, too, that it does fall in somewhat chronological order, but you don't feel confined to... It's not like at the beginning of each section it's a certain set of years necessarily.
Right.
There's a ballpark, but there's you're not confined. You don't confine yourself to say, well, I can't talk about airplanes in this chapter because we haven't gotten there yet.
Yes, I mean, someone asked reasonably the other day, well, there is the sixth element, which is occasionally brought into play, which is air. So why didn't you talk about airplanes under air? And I said, well, this is a 150,000-word book. I mean, America is a gigantic subject. I could have put in a sixth category in, but my editor, I think he was saying, wait a minute.
It's got a nice length.
It's got heft to it, so we don't want to turn it into an encyclopedia or a Sears catalogue, right?
Well, I thought it was it allows you as a writer, I think, to try new things as well. It gives you a construct to which to work in, but really lets you take your imagination, which perhaps as a historian you might not get to use as much as...
Right. I mean, I must say, I think of all the books I've done recently, this was the most fun. I mean, it was... I was initially thinking, how will Americans, but then I'm an American, so I join you in this, feel about being examined through the prism of Chinese philosophy. But it's not really, because these five elements are essential really to all of our lives. It's just that the Chinese that classified things like that 2 millennia ago.
Yeah. Switching topics slightly, the publication of your book almost coincided with the shutdown of the U.S. government. It happened a couple weeks later, I think. I'd love to hear, without getting too political.
Well, exactly. I'm well aware of that. Very hard to.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on, not only as someone who has just written about uniting the states, but also as a newly minted, I know it's 2011, I think, but
it still feels pretty new to me.
But as a newly minted American citizen, your thoughts on that process, and I think strikes some of us as exactly contradictory to what you highlight in your book.
As a lot of people say, I mean, this tour began when the shutdown was going on, and they would say, how on earth can you write a book called The Men Who United the States when the United States is so apparently disunited? Yeah. Well, I mean, a number of things to say about that. I mean, I think America is a great deal better than her politicians, quite honestly. And
this might be true around.
Right. But America has survived a lot of extraordinary, terrible national experiences. I mean, not least, of course, the Civil War in the 1860s, and yet America bounced back from that. It took a long time, but it survived, and the guiding principles of this country survived Lincoln's assassination. It survived the Great Depression. It survived lunacies like prohibition. I mean, for God's sake, I don't want to offend any diehard people that are temperance adherents, but it seems pretty astonishing to me that could be not only legislation, but in the Constitution, that you're not allowed to buy or sell liquor. It survived the Dust Bowl. It survived, as I said, the Depression. It survived, Millard Fillmore, the Know Nothing Party, all sorts of extraordinary political parties and sub-parties. And it survived the 9/11. As a nation, it survived and recovered itself. It's surviving, it seems, the current recession, which we're climbing out of. And it will survive the nonsense that seems to be going on in Washington these days. This is just aberrant behavior, and America just sort of shrugs it off, is wounded by it, but bounces back. And that's one of the things that I so like about this country, that it has, nonetheless, it dusts itself off and thought, well, that was pretty idiotic. But I have to say that, one of the things I go on about in the second part of the book is the Early Geologists, and there are 4 great surveys in the 1860s. And 2 of them were a man called Hayden, who essentially mapped Yellowstone, and John Wesley Powell, who, despite only having one arm, the earlier one being shot off in the Battle of Shiloh,
amazing story,
mapped and went down the Grand Canyon. Those 2, I think, great heroes of mine, would have been spinning in their graves, I think, if they knew that the national parks that they had essentially discovered, Yellowstone and the Grand Canyon, were shut down, that the public couldn't see them because of some trivial ideological dispute in Washington, D.C. I think they would have thought that was madness. But we survived it nonetheless.
Yeah. It was interesting reading this book, just having come out of that experience, and you can only hope that the wonderful characters, both known and somewhat forgotten, I would say, might serve as a reference point for some of our
I don't know, the one political point that I think is that sort of shines out of one of the chapters of this book relates to, big government. I mean, big government is very important in this book, as perhaps we can talk about, but if I can just talk about one little thing, which was rural electrification. I mean, in the 5th part, which is devoted in part to how electricity was brought to the farms in America in the 1930s, there was a British, and I say this wearing my former hat as a Briton, so a man called Samuel Insull, who essentially controlled most of the Midwestern electric utility companies in the 1930s. And he thought it was complete waste of time, and more importantly, a waste of money, to wire the farms in the middle of America. They're expensive beyond belief to string poles and copper wire to them. And yet the farms, there were 800,000 of them, and producing food at an enormous pace because America was getting hungry and more prosperous, but they were left without electricity. Well, Roosevelt, when he came to the power in the 1930s and had this gigantic government apparatus, one aspect of it was the REA, the Rural Electrification Administration, and the stories of how it brought electric power to people. I think they're wonderfully touching stories. The night the lights came on in rural communities all over America. But the political point that I think is worth making is that the first community in America to benefit from FDR's rural electrification was in western Ohio in 1935, a little town called Miami, Ohio, and actually a little town outside Miami, where the farms got electricity. They were the first ones in the country to feel the largesse of the federal government at its biggest. Well, that town is in the 8th Congressional District of Ohio, which is a congressional district represented in Congress today by John Boehner. So John Boehner, the man who is the archetype foe of big government, his people benefited mightily from the biggest big government America has ever known. So take that, Mr. Boehner, I want to say.
And as a citizen and a voter, I'm sure that you can take actual action.
I would like to write to say but unfortunately I don't live in Miami, Ohio. Right?
Yeah. But it is interesting to think about. I mean, from Lewis and Clark, who are funded by Thomas Jefferson and the government, to the Transcontinental Railroad, to to the electrical projects of the Depression. So much of that was, if not completely funded, it was certainly driven and by big government.
Well, and also, I mean, this sort of is about the profession that the two of us are in today. The guidebooks that I took with me when I visited, because I must have visited, I think, all of the states, the contiguous 48 anyway, to do research for this book, I collected all of the WPA guides that had been made in the 1930s, because they were stellar pieces of literature. You get the guide for Iowa or the guide for Oregon, made in the 1930s and the early 1940s, financed by the government to give work to unemployed writers and photographers and editors who were all out of work because of the Great Depression. And you get the California Guide, which has essays on California written by John Steinbeck, who didn't have work at the time and accepted a government check. So, I mean, that's believe you me, despite coming from Britain and despite, socialized medicine and all those things which we're supposed to have, I think government needs to be controlled, of course, but when government works well, the REA, really well. The WPA guides, the Boulder Dam, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the moon shot, government can be extremely effective, and it shouldn't, in my view, be tossed overboard in the way that some politicians are threatening to do.
Well, it will be interesting to see how the next couple months in Washington.
It will indeed.
I do want to make sure we get to Google and the internet and your opinion there, but I would like to talk a little bit about geology and you were a geology major at university, I believe.
Yes.
And you've been able I think you were a geologist by trade for a few years before.
For a year, yes.
Becoming into journalism. It's been wonderful to see the books that you've written over at least the past couple of years have this very passionate focus on what's beneath the surface and beneath the earth. And some of the most interesting characters I think that came out of this book were some of the old geologists, the original geologists for the United States. So I'm interested in what appealed to you originally about geology and how you maintain that interest in the science over the past 50 years or so.
I wish I could tell you that my entry into geology was because of a passionate schoolboy love of ammonites or rocks, but it wasn't. I initially wanted to be a sailor, and I wanted to wander around the world, and I took all my exams and everything to go to Dartmouth, which is the equivalent of Annapolis in Britain, and passed all the exams until I came to do the medical, and then he showed me, the doctor, a loose leaf book with circles with dots on it. And he said, "What number do you see in that circle?" And I said, 47. And he looked at me and he said, "Are you serious?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "We turned to another one." They were red and green and blue dots. And I said, 23. And he shut the book with this terrible finality and said, "Mr. Winchester, I'm terribly sorry to have to tell you that Her Majesty the Queen takes a rather dim view of people driving her very expensive warships around the world who can't tell red from green and therefore left from right. So I'm afraid another career will." So then there was an advert in the school sort of careers office. There was a picture of a man in shorts with a hammer standing on some mountain in Africa saying, "See the world, be a geologist." And I thought, well, if I can't tell red from green, maybe I can tell ammonites from graptolites. And so I took an O-level, which is an exam you take at 16, and passed it, and then went up to Oxford to study it, and loved it, but wasn't terribly good at it, and so was shipped off to Uganda and worked in the mountains between Uganda and Congo looking for copper. Didn't find a microgram of copper. And then worked on an oil rig in the North Sea for a while, and actually did find quite a lot of gas in those days. But then, through a rather complicated set of circumstances, drifted away from geology and into journalism, but still have this affection for the science, and so write about it whenever I can.
And it's nice that now that you're able to perhaps select the topics that you'd like to write about, you can return to those roots, as it were. And
Well, and indeed, the book I'm working on now is quite a big book about the Pacific Ocean, and there's heaps of geology there because there's the whole Ring of Fire, and so I'll have great fun with that. Yeah.
And it's nice. So you've gone from the Atlantic to focusing on the continental
U.S., yeah.
and now onto the Pacific.
Well, HarperCollins, my publishers, who I'm enormously fond of course, I keep saying trilogy. Whether it'll ever be a boxed set, I don't know. But it does seem to have a logic to it. Atlantic,
It does, yeah.
America, Pacific. Yes. We'll see.
So you end the book by discussing the internet and its power to connect not only the U.S., but also the world, whether as a dream or as a nightmare.
Yes, and incidentally, I should say that one of the places that I lingered at but wasn't able to get into was the Council Bluffs in Iowa, where the old drive-in movie theatre is now a great big Google server farm. Very impressive, I must say. I went to server farms, but Google was rather private about their own. So anyway,
Certainly.
I stood outside like a boy sort of in a zoo and looked through, but I think I know more or less what's in there. But yes, the thing that I think interests me about whether the internet is a unifying thing or not, I think goes back to my feelings about radio. I think radio is the great national and cultural unifier. The image you have of the walnut-panelled behemoth in the living room with the family gathered around it, mother, father, children, dogs, cats, all listening to a program that's the NBC Symphony Orchestra being beamed in from New York City, or a comedy program coming in from Los Angeles, or a drama being sent down from Chicago, is an image both of sort of national unity and also familial unity. But then came television, which preserved this unity for a while. Everyone watched Johnny Carson, everyone watched Jack Paar. But then came cable television, and cable television, which came about initially in West Virginia in the 1970s, then had, and unconsciously at first, it started dividing people, so that Dad was in the den watching ESPN, and Mum, I don't want to be sexist about this, was watching another kind of program. And then soon the internet exacerbated this, and everyone in the family was doing something different. Seldom now, unless they're big news events like the moon landing or 9/11 or the killing of a president, few electronically transmitted events bring everyone together. They tend to divide people into their little interest groups. And I'm afraid, with my belief that unity in a country like this is terribly important, that splitting it into intellectual subgroups, which is something the internet seems to be doing, is inimical to that, basically, idea. I think society will deal with it, but at the moment I think it's an open question as to how it will deal with it. So I think, of course, I think the internet's wonderful, but I think it has social aspects to disunity which are somewhat troubling.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about all of your book focuses on unifying the U.S., where the internet is certainly a more global phenomenon.
Well, certainly, yeah.
Being able to, if the railroad started, the U.S. was the first country with the transcontinental railroad, and being able to expand that to the world, there's certainly some parallels there. But the internet, I think, is the first mode to be able to
span the world,
the world,
yeah.
Which is, in some ways, I agree with you, which is a frightening but also very liberating idea.
It is, and if I'm silent, it's just that I don't know how to deal with it. It's a social enigma to me at the moment, and the experience of cable television and the internet in dealing with the United States tends to run counter to my hope and thesis that's in the book.
Yep.
But as I say, this book, I think, and I hope you feel it sort of radiates optimism.
Definitely.
The fact that the country has survived all these ills and come up smiling every time.
Yeah.
I'm not saying the internet is an ill, but I think society will deal with it in a sensible and pragmatic way.
And in the same way that when radio first came out, there were tons of fears about what this influence could be on the other or uneducated populace of the U.S. and what did you want that demon box sitting in your living room speaking to you? And so I think I see similar reactions to other previous mass communication inventions.
Yes, I mean almost everything in this. I mean, starting with the telegraph. I mean, Samuel Morse's invention. It's everyone was hostile initially. I mean, look at the trouble that Morse had to get Congress to agree to any kind of experiment, any kind of funding for it. But then, of course, suddenly they embraced it and realized what Morse had realized for some years. So many of these people are people pounding on the door and saying, look, believe me, this is a great, great idea. Yeah. But it's interesting, of course, that the internet grew out of a government-sponsored idea. The ARPANET, after all, was a government idea. I wonder whether ruin the technology here to play you the first, I don't think it will, the first voice that was ever transmitted over the radio. Okay. I mean, because going back to what we were talking about a few moments ago, about how the radio is a great unifying medium. Well, of course, when radio was invented, it was all Morse code. What Marconi sent and received from Signal Hill in Newfoundland was Morse. But it took this extraordinary and forgotten man called Reginald Fessenden to come up with AM and FM that we know all about. Another wonderful name, Reginald Aubrey Fessenden. And he was the first person ever to broadcast human voice over the radio, which began the national conversation. And this was the voice. And I think got it queued up, so if I'm anywhere near the microphone, I think you should be able to hear it. And this was sent out to all the ships at sea working for the United Fruit Company. He sent a message by Morse just before Christmas, 1906, telling these operators to listen out at 1 minute to midnight on Christmas Eve for a special broadcast. And so it happened to be a dark and stormy night. And off Cape Cod, there was a huge blizzard blowing. And the ships that were bringing bananas up from places like Tegucigalpa in Honduras to Boston and Baltimore and New York City tuned in their radios and listened through the static and the Morse chatter of other ships, but instead of Morse, they heard this. And that's a singer called Emmy Leisner singing Ombra Mai Fu, which is nothing to do with America. It's all to do with a Persian king and a shade tree. And after that was over, then Fessenden himself, who was a big burly man with a wonderful bass voice, came on and said the Lord's Prayer, and then said a very happy Christmas to you all. And the first voice broadcast ever broadcast to the public ended, but within a week, over in Pasadena, a radio station opened above Sherman's, a musical instrument store, which still exists, selling or playing music. And then 3 months later, in a cornfield in Madison, Wisconsin, an aerial was built, and the first ever radio station, which became WHA, which still exists. And then the national conversation began. But I love the thought that that beautiful piece of music was the beginning of the conversation, all to do with bananas as well.
That's that story right there is, one of the things that also appealed to me about the book is that you intersperse within a lot of the biography or history parts your own personal experiences of visiting some of these places. At first, reading the first person in a nonfiction book or a history book sometimes can have a jarring effect. But I found this to be very, very natural.
Well, thank you.
And it was being able to visualize those places, today, I thought was a fascinating look at some, how we've forgotten some of these very important markers, for example.
Well, one of the things, the journeys that I really enjoyed for this book was discovering the origins of the Interstate Highway System, which, we conventionally believe it's known as the Eisenhower system of interstate and defense highways, because Eisenhower saw the Autobahns in Germany in 1945. Well, he did, but that's not the reason the system has got that name. It's because he was an observer as a young major on an expedition run by the Army in 1919 to cross the country in military vehicles from the south lawn of the White House to San Francisco as rapidly as possible to thwart a theoretical Japanese invasion of California. The generals at the National War College thought, what if the Japanese, who were getting somewhat restless, even the early part of the last century, what would happen if they invaded California? How quickly could we get troops from the big bases in the east by road across to defend the west coast? So they assembled this convoy, about 3 miles long, of tanks and armored vehicles and commissary wagons and hospitals and jeeps and things, with the young, he was in his 20s, Major Eisenhower as an observer, and to keep a diary. It was a complete shambles. I mean, it took 58 days. They went an average speed of 6 miles an hour. And believe you me, if the Japanese had invaded, they would have swallowed up California and Arizona and New Mexico, and probably, and possibly for the benefit of us all, would have taken most of West Texas as well. But Eisenhower's diary, I got a copy of it, thanks to the internet, of course, and decided to follow and go to each of the places that these soldiers had been on. And one of them was a place that I had wanted to go to since I was a 15-year-old, and that's the town of Denison, Iowa, not too far, actually, from your Google complex in Council Bluffs. Mm-hmm. Denison I'd wanted to go to because it was the birthplace of the woman that I, as a 15-year-old, thought was the most beautiful woman in the world. And the Army team had been there in 1919. They had played, I think, baseball, had lost to the citizens of Denison. They had watched films in the Denison Opera House. I mean, how wonderful that there's an opera house in a little town in western Iowa. But 2 years later, obviously unconnected with the soldiers' visit, a child was born called Donna Mullinger. And she grew up. She was wanting to become a teacher, but her parents didn't have the money to send her to school. And so she got on the Union Pacific train at Omaha and went to Hollywood. Mm-hmm. Attractiveness allowed her to be signed by MGM. And initially she was called Donna Adams, but because the 2 A's didn't allow her name to be said very easily, they changed her name to Donna Reed. And Donna Reed, when I saw that movie, The Wonderful Life, mm-hmm. when she played Mrs. George Bailey, I thought she, in Bedford Falls, was just the apotheosis of American beauty. And so I wanted to go to where she was born. So I went there, and there is the old opera house is now the Donna Reed Performing Arts Center. Mm-hmm. And the Oscar she won for From Here to Eternity, she for some reason didn't win it for It's a Wonderful Life, is there. And Fat Moe's in Chicago had donated a soda fountain counter, so that's there, which is where young George Bailey got hit in the ear. So if you remember, he was deaf in the movie, or half deaf. And but the extraordinary thing about it is that, attractive a town though it may be, it's absolutely stinks. And it stinks because 2 miles away to the west of the town is a gigantic feedlot in which 200,000 cattle are standing all the time, providing beef for the hungry people of the East Coast. But when the wind is in the wrong direction, this terrible miasma of cattle and everything, all their products, sweeps over Denison and makes it a less beautiful place than I imagined it would be. Yeah.
And it's those, I mean, I think, and I see this through many of your books, is you're more of a storyteller, I see, than a historian. You have, there's such easy books to read, I find, not to make it too simple, but they're so engaging, and it's stories like that I think move you through the book.
Well, it's very nice of you to say so, but I'm pleased that the reviews thus far, a number of them have been by academics, and I'm always wary and thinking academics might not like a book that is, as you say, more stories than perhaps classical history, but they've said nice things. Yeah.
So you've been very productive in since I guess I look at 1998 when you really started being an author full-time,
yes.
Let's say. 10 books, I think, in 15 years and 5 New York Times bestsellers. So we at Google have certainly looked at a lot of metrics and done a lot of research in how productive people are.
I'm now getting terrified about what you're going to tell me.
We've certainly looked at what makes people productive and not only quality but quantity. Any tips that you can provide on how to maintain such a high level of work, but certainly been so productive over the past.
Well, I remember when I was small, the preferred newspaper in our house was the Daily Telegraph, and they ran an advertisement every day, I think, on the front page for some course called Pellmanism. I have no idea what Pellmanism was, but the question at the top was, do you have a grasshopper mind? If you have a grasshopper mind, then you should take a course in Pellmanism. And my father kept threatening. He said, you just keep, everything's all over the map with you. You're going to be a dilettante. You're going to be know nothing at all well. I'm going to sign you up for a course on Pellmanism, and I'm jolly glad he didn't. So my first piece of advice is do not take a course on Pellmanism.
Right.
But no, I think if you've got a grasshopper mind, encourage it. But I mean, you've got to be very focused, and I think I am. I live on this farm in western Massachusetts, and I've got to study, and I just bury myself away for months at a time and get it done. But I love every aspect. I love the research, and who wouldn't?
I know you do all your own research as well.
Yeah,
it's not.
And then the writing is nice. The editing, when you have to slash away things that the editor like, and you're not allowed to put aeroplanes in the air chapter. In fact, get rid of the air chapter. And that's a bit frustrating. But that aside, the process is great fun. Yeah. So enjoy it.
And I imagine you have, in my imagination, you have a book of like 500 book ideas that you've been collecting over the past 50 years. Is that accurate? You just jot down some? Sort of.
There are all sorts of things I want to do. And now, of course, I'm just coming up to 70. There is the feeling that, so many books to write and so not enough time to do them.
Little time.
But at least I've got 3 or 4 sort of waiting in the wings.
Yeah.
The Pacific is next, and that's what I'm concentrating on now, yeah.
Okay, great. So I would like to point out one part of your book that I took issue with.
Oh, right.
So we're here at Google's New York office in the middle of Manhattan, state-of-the-art building with sun-filled offices and communal workspaces. Does being here change at all your view of employees at technology companies? One of the last lines of your book is, the new pioneers of unification will be technical men hidden quietly out of sight in their blue-lit warehouses, surrounded by silent frenzies of blinking server lights. And I'm not sure if we should be flattered or offended by that.
Please, I have been to your establishment a number of times now. I've eaten in your wonderful cafeteria. I've ridden on your Razor scooters. I've been to Apple. I've been to, yes, the place where the connections, the connective tissue are these cages of servers with these silent guardians in Mountain View and in Cupertino and in Council Bluffs, Iowa. Those are the people I'm writing about here, not the creative people like yourself. So forgive me. And in the paperback, I'll amend it accordingly.
No need. It was just as we were talking about before. I think there are a lot of still open questions that we're working to solve here, not only here at Google, but anybody working in technology. And it's information is a powerful thing.
Well, if you think my metrics are impressive, I think your metrics are astonishing.
Thank you very much. If anybody has any questions from the audience, we feel free to ask them now.
I'm just interested as a historian. Which other historians from the past do you find particularly interesting?
Well, oddly enough, there's an English historian who probably you won't be familiar with, called Arthur Bryant, who did a series of books, the history of Britain and the history of Europe in the 1930s and 40s, and became wildly popular because he told history through human stories. I mean, I like Mayhew, for instance, who wrote the history of London, once again not so much through theses or social movements, but the history of ordinary people and told stories. Narrative social history is what I'm interested in, and those are the kind of people that I like. But I mean, of course, David McCulloch, I think, is absolutely wonderful. Plus, he drives the same kind of Land Rover that I drove, a nice old Land Rover. And he lives in Maine, so he's a good guy as far as I'm concerned. But he's the sort of chap I like, and Arthur Bryant in the past. Yeah.
Another question I had is, you've written about all these different periods in your book here in the U.S. If you could return and live during one of those ages, do you have a
I do, really. I mean, I think, and expanding this beyond the United States, I loved the time when there were polymaths around, people that knew everything, or that had an interest in just about everything and a huge level of competence. And my great hero is James Murray, the editor of the Oxford English Dictionary. I mean, he Latin and Greek and chemistry and physics and philosophy, the tendrils of his imagination spread everywhere. And there were such people in the United States, of course. I mean, Jefferson. I mean, good God. I mean, what an amazing man Thomas Jefferson was. So to live in a period which fostered the Jeffersons and the James Murrays suggests to me, because such people are now either non-existent or not revered or just jabbering on street corners in Manhattan. I don't know where they are. But I'd like to live in a society, I mean, I'm very happy to live nowadays, but I would like to revisit a time when such people were cherished and revered.
Certainly. Well, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much indeed. This has been great. Thank you.